While there are some titles which feel like they'll be around forever at this point, if you look back at wrestling history, the reality is that most belts have an end date. Of course, when this happens, someone gets to have the honor of being the final holder of that title, with this happening to some of the most prestigious titles of all time. But who are the most notable examples of final champions in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the final WCW World Heavyweight Champion, Booker T. Yes, well, technically here, the last ever WCW champion may be classed as Chris Jericho, as he was the one who beat Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock back-to-back in the same night in order to unify it with the WWF title at December 9th, 2001's Vengeance pay-per-view. For the purposes of today's video, we'll be looking at the original WCW version of the title, the one that ended when its parent company did, and that version was held by none other than Booker T. How did Booker T come to be champion as WCW was closing its doors? Well, it was a last-minute thing as it happened, because despite being hot-shotted around a staggering 25 times in 2000, for the last few months of the promotion's existence, it did start to gain some sense of stability again. And the way it gained such stability was by Scott Steiner winning at November 26th's Mayhem pay-per-view and holding it for the next 4 months, all the way up until the final Nitro on March 26, 2001 in fact. Do you think that given how much he'd done to help rescue the belt, Big Papa Pump would get to go down with the ship as the final champion then? But that wasn't the case, because after Vince McMahon purchased the company at this point, he evidently saw more in Booker T as a top guy. And so that was why Booker would defeat Steiner on the last episode of Nitro to become champ. Obviously then, because of outside circumstances, Booker never got to do much of anything during this run. Hell, even when he officially joined WWF in the summer of that year, he'd have dropped the gold to Kurt Angle come the July 26th episode of SmackDown. But even if it was an uneventful run overall, it still marks an important moment in history, because it would be the last time a new WCW World Champion was crowned while that company was still alive in its original incarnation. But what of the other big company of the Monday Night Wars, the one which also died in early 2001? Well, when it comes to ECW, their final World Heavyweight Champion is a lot clearer, as WWF didn't bring their belt over to WWF once they bought them too. No, the last person to hold that was none other than Rhino. And yes, while it's easy to associate him with the glory days of Paul Heyman's Renegade promotion, Rhino's time in Extreme Championship Wrestling actually came during their later years, with him being one of the few wrestlers that helped to keep things afloat in Philadelphia for as long as possible. Of course, his value was never more evident than in 2001, as this was the point where, desperately trying to shake things up and capture fans' attention again, Heyman decided to put the title on Rhino, as he was someone who felt fresh and new as a top guy. And the way Heyman made this change was somewhat unique too, as the big win actually marked the second time the ECW World Heavyweight title changed hands on that night. That's right, at January 7th, 2001's Guilty as Charged pay-per-view, after the Sandman defeated Just Incredible and incoming champion Steve Corino in a tables, ladders, and canes match, Rhino came out to challenge the fan favorite, and after this challenge was accepted, he beat him in just 1 minute to become the new top dog in the promotion. Does this make the beginning of the last ECW champion's reign somewhat anticlimactic? Sure. But at least the Detroit native got to hold on to it for a few months after that before Paul Heyman officially closed the doors of Extreme in April. And it does at least mean the last champion in the brand during its original incarnation was someone who was able to embody the spirit of what it had been at its best. But what about the other version of the belt, the WWECW World title? Well, its final champion was none other than Ezekiel Jackson. That's right, the man most well known for being a former member of the Core and fixture on WWECW during the late 2000s, and as it happens, when that brand closed its doors in February of 2010, he'd be the last person to hold their world title. How did he come to be holding this title? Well, like with Booker T's WCW World Heavyweight title win, it would come on the last night of the show's existence. Yes, it was during the final episode of ECW TV on the 16th of that month that Jackson got the better of incoming champ Christian, and as a result walked out of their match the new holder of the top prize. Not that he'd get anything to do with it afterwards though, as, like we said a moment ago, this was literally the last night of the brand's existence, and so it would be immediately deactivated afterwards. But what about our next subject, Nikki Cross? As back in 2022, she was the one who formally deactivated the 24/7 title, and as such, became the last person to ever hold it. Yes, the 24/7 title was a belt that never quite caught on with many fans, as it was often compared to the nostalgia of the hardcore title. And as well as this, most weeks on Raw we would see the same story play out, with a group of superstars chasing R-Truth around backstage, someone eventually pinning him, and then Truth immediately pinning them to get his baby back. That's right, while the 24/7 title did have a lot of potential and gave us some funny moments during Truth's reigns, the title never quite felt as special as it could have. That said, when it comes to the last night of its existence, the November 7th, 2022 episode of Raw, R-Truth was actually nowhere to be seen, as at this point, the champion was Scotland's own Nikki ASH. And as it happened, she'd actually held the belt for a total of 11 days by that point, an eternity in 24/7 title terms. But evidently deciding she didn't want anything more to do with it then, especially as she was now already in the process of fully transforming back into her old Nikki Cross character. While walking backstage, the Scotswoman would casually throw the belt in the trash, with this being the last time it was ever seen on screen. And with Vince McMahon now gone from WWE, the chances of us ever seeing this particular belt again are slim to none, and Nikki Cross will forever go down as the final champion in the belt's lineage. But what about our next subject, Bron Breakker, one of the top up-and-coming superstars on Monday Night Raw? Well, his greatness has been evident since his days in NXT, as this is where he'd go on to become the face of the brand for a couple of years, where he achieved numerous accolades, including the time he became the last person to ever hold the NXT United Kingdom Championship. But wait, how could Bron Breakker have been the last NXT UK champion when he never actually wrestled on this brand? After all, we're talking about a title that was for the most part defended in an entirely separate continent to where he lives, with it usually being contested over by the likes of Pete Dunne, Tyler Bate, Ilya Dragunov, and our Lord and Savior Gunther. Well, the way this one came about was a result of NXT UK officially closing down in the summer of 2022. But even if NXT UK was finishing up, that didn't mean the North American branch of the developmental brand couldn't still get one big show out of the whole thing, with this being exactly what led us to the Worlds Collide show on September 4th, 2022, where all the NXT and NXT UK belts would be unified. When it came to the top prizes for each respective show then, this meant it would be NXT champion Bron Breakker going up against NXT United Kingdom champion Tyler Bate. And for as great as Bate was, and continues to be, in the end, there was no way he was going to win against Bron. So once it was all said and done, Breakker would be the man holding both belts aloft then, and as they were unified from there on in, it also meant he'd be the last person we'd ever see in possession of the NXT UK brand's biggest prize. Is there a chance we ever see this one make a comeback? Sure, we suppose it's possible, if Triple H ever decides to restart his plans for creating new worldwide branches of NXT once more. But until that happens, we think it's pretty safe to say the NXT United Kingdom Championship is gone, and we won't be seeing it again. But that wasn't the only belt the brand had, of course. In fact, it wasn't even the only world title, as there was also the NXT United Kingdom Women's Championship, with the last person to hold this being Mandy Rose. Yes, like with the men's belt, the NXT UK Women's title was a casualty of the British side of things closing its doors in the summer of 2022. And that's a real shame because, again, like with the men's title, this belt had a pretty proud, if ultimately short, lineage. Need an example of just how proud this lineage was? Well, just look at the fact that its first two holders were Rhea Ripley and Toni Storm, two of the most over women in all of wrestling right now. By the time it came to Worlds Collide in November of that year, though, the same Worlds Collide show where Bron Breakker beat Tyler Bate, it would be Japanese-born star Miko Satomura who was in possession of the gold after she'd beaten Kaylee Ray for it 2 years prior. That's right, this was quite a lengthy run, but a fitting one for the former Red Belt champion in Stardom, as she truly was, and is, one of the best women's performers out there. In the end, though, she proved to be no match for Mandy Rose because at this point in time, she was in the midst of her own 413-day run as NXT Women's Champion, and was being set up for seemingly big things in the future by WWE management. So when Rose and Satomura met on September 4th, 2022 then, it would be the former who came out the victor after 13 minutes and 17 seconds. And as she lifted both belts above her head after that, she did so safe in the knowledge that no one else would ever get to carry the UK version of this strap again following this. And while she may now have left the promotion, the fact remains that Mandy Rose will always be the final NXT United Kingdom Women's Champion, providing the WWE doesn't choose to revive the brand at some point down the line. But those aren't the only examples of a belt largely defended in NXT which went on to be deactivated in 2022, as the same thing happened in January of that year when the last holder of the NXT Cruiserweight title became Carmelo Hayes. Yes, this is the more modern version of the Cruiserweight title we're talking about here, not the one from the 90s and 2000s, which was defended in both WCW and WWE, as the lineage of that one formally ended in 2007 when Hornswoggle was holding it. No, this belt had an entirely different end to it, as after the belt moved away from being a Raw title and then moving on to get its own show in 205 Live, the title would eventually become exclusive to NXT in 2019. With its lineage having some pretty great performers hold it, performers such as Santos Escobar, Kushida, and Roderick Strong. In the end though, none of these people would be the last person to hold this particular prize, as on the January 4th, 2022 episode of NXT, entitled New Year's Evil, incoming champion Strong would defend against NXT North American champion Carmelo Hayes in a unification match. And while Roddy is great, even he wasn't good enough to overcome the power of him on that night, which was exactly why, after 15.5 minutes, it was Hayes who came out on top, and as a result, was able to call himself the last ever NXT Cruiserweight Champion. Would it have been nice to see him defend it for a little while after this? Sure, but that just wasn't in the plans at that time, presumably because WWE wanted to cut down on the amount of titles they had. So we'll just have to settle for the idea that Carmelo got to call himself Cruiserweight Champion for a few minutes at least, and as it stands in the record books, he'll remain the final stop when it comes to that lineage. Hell, even if WWE decides to ever revive this particular piece of hardware, as they've been known to do before, there's still a pretty good chance they'll restart the lineage from scratch this time. So Carmelo will probably still be the last champ in that specific incarnation, but while there's every possibility we'll see the Cruiserweight title again one day, one title we almost certainly won't see again will be the Light Heavyweight title, which was last held by X-Pac in 2001. Why is that? Well, why would WWE need this one anymore? Especially if the Cruiserweight equivalent was an option. After all, the only reason this belt was ever brought over to the WWF in the first place was so the company could try to compete with what WCW were doing in that same division during the mid to late 90s. And we say brought over because the WWF Light Heavyweight Championship did actually exist prior to this, though only as a belt defended in Mexico and Japan for promotions such as the Universal Wrestling Association, Michinoku Pro Wrestling, and in Japan. But while there might have been some prestige to the light heavyweight title at this point, by the time it made its way stateside in late 1997, it quickly became clear that it wasn't going to be a patch on what was happening in WCW. And that was evident in the way it was treated during its last days, as after winning the belt from Jeff Hardy on the August 19, 2001 episode of Raw, X-Pac never defended it on TV. And after a while, he just stopped bringing it down to the ring with him altogether. That's right, there was no grand send-off here. In fact, there was no send-off at all, as after months of fans wondering what was going on with it, WWE quietly announced that the belt had been deactivated on March 8, 2002, when Sean Waltman went down due to injury. Should more have been done with this one in terms of giving it a fond farewell? Maybe, but then it was never treated all that fondly in the first place by management or by fans. So perhaps this is the most fitting way for the story of the light heavyweight title to end, not with a bang, but with a whimper. And like we said a moment ago, don't expect this one to come back anytime soon, as there really is no reason for WWE to revive it anymore, meaning that X-Pac will likely always be able to say he was the last person to hold it. Still, it could have been worse because at least this belt was officially sanctioned by the company, the same of which could never be said for our next entry, the $1 Million title. And that's because this one was always technically unofficial when it comes to the record books, even when it was being held by its last champion, Cameron Grimes. Yes, as far back in 1989 when Ted DiBiase decided that, in his frustration over not being able to buy the WWF World title, he was going to create his own, the $1 Million title has always lived under the radar somewhat as an unofficial renegade belt, not that dissimilar to the way the FTW title is treated in AEW today. It doesn't matter who held it during that first run, whether it be Virgil, Steve Austin, or DiBiase himself, the reality was always the same. And even when the title briefly returned in 2010, when Ted DiBiase Jr. was awarded the belt by his father, the championship was never quite considered fully a canon prize within the company, with it never really being defended. No, the biggest thing of note that happened during this era of the belt's lineage was that Goldust would steal the title and then return it back to DiBiase Sr., with him attempting to award it back to his son, all before DiBiase Jr. decided he no longer wanted it. So this also meant that when the belt came back in 2021, now being an NXT exclusive, it was still treated as something not formally recognized in the record books. So when then champion LA Knight went into battle with Cameron Grimes on TakeOver 36 on August 22nd of that year, then it was less about winning a piece of hardware that was going to change the trajectory of one of the wrestlers' careers and more about simple pride. Of course, come the end of things, this pride would be worn proudly by everyone's favorite stock market master, as after a bout which waged on for 13.5 minutes, it was him who came out the victor. And while at that point you might have expected Grimes to go on something of a run as champion, he decided instead not to do so, as on the following week's episode of NXT, it was revealed that DiBiase had switched out the new Champs belt with a replica and had driven off with the original, which we guess in a way makes him the last champion? It's really unclear, but given the fuzzy history of this one, it was always going to be. And as there's a pretty decent chance we see it pop up again someday, that fuzziness will likely continue to be an issue. But whatever happens in the future, as it stands right now, we're going to call Cameron Grimes the last $1 Million champion, as he was the final person to win it in the ring. And the same goes for the logic behind who the last European champion was too, because the final person to win this in the ring was none other than Rob Van Dam. Now, if you were watching Raw during the early 2000s, then you might remember the period where WWE decided to unify mid-card titles with the world title. Yes, over the course of a couple of months in the summer of that year, we saw the hardcore European and Intercontinental titles all disappear from TV entirely, with only the IC title ever returning to WWE as an active prize to this day. The one we want to focus on here is not the hardcore or Intercontinental titles, however, rather it's the European title, the one that was created in 1997 for the British Bulldog and basically served as the prototype for what would later become the NXT United Kingdom title years later. And that's because while this one might have started out with some promise, by the time the turn of the millennium came around, it was seen as pretty much third rate. So when it came time to unify it with the IC strap on the July 22nd, 2002 episode of Raw, not many fans really batted an eyelid. No, for the most part, people were okay with this belt disappearing. The only question people had, in fact, was who was going to be the person holding it when it was finally deactivated. Would it be incoming champion Jeff Hardy, or would it be then Intercontinental champion Rob Van Dam? Well, the answer to that question is RVD. Yes, after getting the better of Hardy in a ladder match that evening, Mr. Monday Night would walk out with both sets of gold, with this being the last time we'd ever see the European title on our screens to this day. Of course, such success wouldn't last for long because just 22 days later he'd be defeated by Chris Jericho, and just a month after that, all the mid-card belts would be merged into Triple H's Ultimate Reign of Terror prize. Yes, it was an anticlimactic end to the title, and one that has gone forgotten by many fans today, but at least we're past that now and can look back on not only the European title fondly, but also all of the other titles we've looked at today.